These have given us fairly trustworthy information. Primitive man maintained a very curious attitude towards death. It is not at all consistent, but rather contradictory. On the one hand, he took death very seriously, recognized it as the termination of life, and made use of it in this sense. But on the other hand, he also denied death and reduced it to nothing. This contradiction was made possible by the fact that he maintained a radically different position in regard to the death of others, a stranger or an enemy, than in regard to his own. The death of another person fitted in with his idea. It signified the annihilation of the hated one, and primitive man had no scruples against bringing it about. He must have been a very passionate being, more cruel and vicious than other animals. He liked to kill, and did it as a matter of course. Nor need we attribute to him the instinct which restrains other animals from killing and devouring their own species. As a matter of fact, the primitive history of mankind is filled with murder. The history of the world which is still taught to our children is essentially a series of race murders. The dimly felt sense of guilt under which man has lived since archaic times, and which in many religions has been condensed into the assumption of a primal guilt, a hereditary sin, is probably the expression of a blood guilt, the burden of which primitive man assumed. In my book entitled Totem and Taboo, 1913, I have followed the hints of W. Robertson Smith, Atkinson, and Charles Darwin in the attempt to fathom the nature of this ancient guilt, and am of the opinion that the Christian doctrine of today still makes it possible for us to work back to its origin. If the Son of God had to sacrifice his life to absolve mankind from original sin, then, according to the law of retaliation, the return of like for like, this sin must have been an act of killing, a murder. Nothing else could call for the sacrifice of a life in expiation. And if original sin was a sin against the God-Father, the oldest sin of mankind must have been a patricide, the killing of the primal father of the primitive human horde, whose memory picture later was transfigured into a deity. Primitive man was as incapable of imagining and realizing his own death as any one of us are today. But a case arose in which the two opposite attitudes towards death clashed and came into conflict with each other, with results that are both significant and far-reaching. Such a case was given when primitive man saw one of his own relatives die, his wife, child, or friend, whom he certainly loved as we do ours, for love cannot be much younger than the lust for murder. In his pain, he must have discovered that he too could die, an admission against which his whole being must have revolted, for every one of these loved ones was a part of his own beloved self. On the other hand, every such death was satisfactory to him, for there was also something foreign in each one of these persons. The law of emotional ambivalence, which today still governs our emotional relations to those whom we love, certainly obtained far more widely in primitive times. The beloved dead had nevertheless roused some hostile feelings in primitive man, just because they had been both friends and enemies. Philosophers have maintained that the intellectual puzzle which the picture of death presented to primitive man forced him to reflect, and became the starting point of every speculation. I believe the philosophers here think too philosophically. They give too little consideration to the primary effective motive. I should therefore like to correct and limit the above assertion. Primitive man probably triumphed at the side of the corpse of the slain enemy without finding any occasion to puzzle his head about the riddle of life and death. It was not the intellectual puzzle or any particular death which roused the spirit of inquiry in man, but the conflict of emotions at the death of beloved and, withal, foreign and hated persons. From this emotional conflict, psychology arose. Man could no longer keep death away from him, for he had tasted of it in his grief for the deceased. But he did not want to acknowledge it, since he could not imagine himself dead. He therefore formed a compromise, and concealed his own death, but denied it the significance of destroying life, a distinction for which the death of his enemies had given him no motive. He invented spirits during his contemplation of the corpse of the person he loved, and his consciousness of guilt over the gratification which mingled with his grief brought it about that these first created spirits were transformed into evil demons which were to be feared. The changes wrought by death suggested to him to divide the individual into body and soul, at first several souls, and in this way his train of thought paralleled the disintegration process inaugurated by death. The continued remembrance of the dead became the basis of the assumption of other forms of existence, and gave him the idea of a future life after apparent death. These later forms of existence were at first only vaguely associated appendages to those whom death had cut off, and enjoyed only slight esteem until much later times. They still betrayed a very meagre knowledge. The reply which the soul of Achilles made to Odysseus comes to our mind. Quote, "Erst in the life on earth, no less than a god we revered thee, we the Achaeans, and now in the realm of the dead, as a monarch, here thou dost rule. Then why should death thus grieve thee, Achilles?" Thus did I speak. Forthwith, then answering thus, he addressed me. "Speak not smoothly of death, I beseech, O famous Odysseus. Better by far to remain on the earth as the thrall of another, e'en of a portionless man that hath means right scanty of living, rather than reign sole king in the realm of the bodiless phantoms." Unquote. Odysseus, chapter 11, verses 484 through 491, translated by H.B. Cotterill. Heine has rendered this in a forcible and bitter parody. Quote, "The smallest living Philistine at Stuckert on the Neckar is much happier than I am, son of Peleus, the dead hero, shadowy ruler of the underworld." Unquote. It was much later before the religions managed to declare this afterlife as the more valuable and perfect, and to debase our mortal life to a mere preparation for the life to come. It was then only logical to prolong our existence into the past, and to invent former existences, transmigrations of souls and reincarnations, all with the object of depriving death of its meaning as the termination of life. It was as early as this that the denial of death, which we described as the product of conventional culture, originated. Contemplation of the corpse of the person loved gave birth not only to the theory of the soul, the belief in immortality, and implanted the deep roots of the human sense of guilt, but it also created the first ethical laws. The first and most important prohibition of the awakening conscience declared, "Thou shalt not kill." This arose as a reaction against the gratification of hate for the beloved dead, which is concealed behind grief, and was gradually extended to the unloved stranger, and finally also to the enemy. Civilized man no longer feels this way in regard to killing enemies. When the fierce struggle of this war will have reached a decision, every victorious warrior